The cold, silent night. The night was cold. The kind of cold that made your breath freeze in the air. The stars above barely twinkled, hidden behind thick clouds that covered the sky like a heavy blanket. The ground below was a frozen wasteland, covered in thick, deep snow that stretched out as far as the eye could see. In the middle of this desolate landscape, there was something, or rather, someone who did not belong. Lying in the snow, half buried and unnoticed, was a small child. Her skin, a pale shade of green, blended perfectly with the icy surroundings. Her face was so still, it almost seemed as if she were a part of the snow itself. Her eyes were closed, her small body curled up in a tight protective position. Her breath came in shallow, weak gasps. She had no family to keep her warm, no shelter to protect her from the biting cold. She was alone, forgotten by the world. She had been abandoned here, left to die in the wilderness. She wasn't human, though her features were almost the same. She was from a far-off planet, a place so distant that few humans had ever heard of it. Her kind was not familiar with Earth, nor was Earth familiar with them. She had been sent on a mission alone to learn about this strange planet. But something had gone wrong. She was stranded, alone in the cold, with no way of getting back home. As the cold continued to wrap itself around her like an endless, suffocating blanket, the little alien child felt herself growing weaker. Her mind was clouded with confusion, her body numb. She had heard stories of the harsh winters on Earth, but she never imagined it would feel like this. She had been on many planets before, but nothing had prepared her for the cold, the loneliness, the emptiness of this place. With every passing moment, her life seemed to slip further away. Her limbs were stiff, her body freezing to the point where it was hard to tell where the snow ended and she began. She tried to move, to escape this frozen nightmare, but her body was too weak, too cold to respond. All she could do was lie there, hoping for something, anything to change, but nothing did. The cold kept coming, the silence overwhelming. She could no longer hear the sounds of the world around her, no birds, no animals, no voices. It was as if the planet itself had abandoned her, leaving her to freeze alone in the night. The longer she lay there, the more she felt herself slipping away, her consciousness fading into darkness. Yet, somewhere deep inside, she still held on. She had heard stories from her people about the humans of this world, about their strange ways, their kindness, and their cruelty. She didn't know if they were true, but she had always hoped that somewhere, someone would come to help her, to save her from this icy tomb. Maybe this world wasn't so cold after all. Maybe there was still hope, but that hope was fading, slipping away like the last breath of a dying star. The child's eyes fluttered open for a moment, but everything around her was a blur of white. She could barely make out the shapes in the distance, shadows that seemed to shift and move like ghosts in the snow. Her vision was failing, her body shutting down, and she wondered if this was the end. The wind howled again, louder than before, and it seemed to echo through the emptiness. It whispered over her body, brushing her skin with icy fingers. She wanted to scream, to cry for help, but there was no one to hear her. She was nothing more than a forgotten creature, abandoned in the cold. Just as she was about to give in to the darkness, something changed. A distant sound reached her ears, footsteps crunching through the snow. They were slow, deliberate, and they grew closer with every passing second. The child's heart skipped a beat, and her weak body tensed. Was it another creature? A predator? Or was it a human, like the stories she had heard? The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. The child could feel the warmth of something, a presence hovering over her. She opened her eyes again, struggling to stay conscious, but the world around her was still a blur. Then, a figure appeared through the haze. A human man, his face hidden by the shadow of his coat, was kneeling beside her. His breath came out. Invisible clouds, and his eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. The child was too weak to react, too cold to do anything other than lie there. The man, on the other hand, seemed frozen in place, his gaze locked on the small, fragile being before him. In that instant, the world seemed to stand still, the snow and cold forgotten as their eyes met. The man didn't speak at first. He just stared, his mind racing. He had never seen anything like this before, an alien child, lying in the snow, cold and alone. He knew he should have been afraid, but something in his chest told him he couldn't leave her there. There was something about her, something that called out to him, even though he didn't understand it. Without thinking, he reached down and gently lifted her into his arms. He wrapped his coat around her, shielding her from the biting cold. The warmth of his body began to seep into her, the first warmth she had felt in what seemed like an eternity. She felt the smallest spark of hope, but it was enough. For the first time since she had been abandoned, the alien child felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Maybe there was a chance for her to survive after all. And so, in the midst of the cold, silent night, a chance encounter changed everything. Asterisk. A human's chance encounter. The snowstorm had picked up, swirling through the air like a chaotic dance of icy particles. The wind howled as if trying to tear everything apart, but the man pressed on, determined to make it to the small cabin he'd been heading toward for the past few days. His boots crunched loudly against the snow, each step bringing him closer to warmth and shelter. His breath came in visible puffs, and his fingers, numb from the cold, clutched his coat tighter around him. He was a simple man, nothing extraordinary, just someone trying to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent to his struggles. His journey had not been an easy one. Days of traveling through the wilderness, with no company but his thoughts, had drained him both physically and mentally. But the thought of returning to civilization, to the warmth of a fire, pushed him forward. He could taste the relief, feel the comfort of shelter just beyond the horizon. Yet, something felt off, something he couldn't quite place. The storm was growing fiercer, and the further he walked, the more the world around him seemed to quiet down, almost eerily so. There were no sounds of wildlife, no distant howls of wolves, or the rustling of branches in the wind. The world was unnervingly still, as though everything had disappeared, leaving him alone in the frozen wasteland. As he trudged along, his eyes scanning the white landscape for signs of life, something caught his attention, something small, almost hidden against the snow. At first, he thought it was just another patch of ice, or perhaps a rock half buried by the snowstorm. But then, the figure shifted, and he froze in place. His heart skipped a beat. There, lying motionless in the snow, was a small form. A child. A child that looked unlike anything he had ever seen before. His breath hitched as he took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. The figure was covered in a strange, pale green skin, and its features were unlike anything he could have imagined. It was small, fragile, and had a face so still that it almost looked like a statue, carved out of ice. The child's body was curled up in a defensive position, arms wrapped around itself as if trying to shield from the cold. There was no sign of life, no movement, but the man could feel something, a strange pull deep inside his chest. He couldn't explain it, but he couldn't leave her there. No one should be alone in the snow like this, no matter who or what they were. His instincts kicked in, and before he knew it, he was kneeling beside the child, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch her. The moment his fingers brushed against her skin, he recoiled slightly, surprised by how cold she was. She felt like ice, like death itself had settled inside her. He had seen many things in his life. He had worked in harsh conditions, faced danger, and even dealt with the loss of loved ones, but never had he felt something as chilling as this. The child's body was frozen, lifeless, and yet there was still a faint pulse beneath the surface. His heart raced with urgency. He knew he had to act fast if there was any hope of saving her. He quickly took off his heavy coat, his breath coming faster now as he wrapped it around her fragile form. His coat was thick and worn, the fabric rough against her smooth, alien skin. He cradled her in his arms, lifting her carefully, trying not to hurt her fragile body. As he did so, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something precious, something beyond human understanding. This child, this alien being, had been abandoned in the snow, left to die in a world that was as cold as her body was. It wasn't just an accident, he realized. Someone or something had placed her here, cast her aside like an object of no value. He felt a wave of anger rise within him, but it was quickly replaced by a strange sense of responsibility. He couldn't leave her. He wouldn't. With every step he took, he felt the weight of her body in his arms, and yet he couldn't bring himself to let go. There was no plan, no clear idea of what to do next. He only knew that he had to get her to safety, to warmth. The storm was too fierce to turn back, and the cabin was still far off. He needed to find shelter, something to keep them both safe. From the storm's wrath, the child's body felt cold, but as he held her against his chest, he began to feel a faint warmth seeping through. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope. He adjusted his grip, holding her tighter, his footsteps growing more determined as he pushed through the snow. Her head rested against his shoulder, her alien face still, her large eyes closed, as though in deep sleep. She seemed so fragile, so small against his broad chest. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder about her. Where had she come from? Why was she alone? Was she part of a larger group, or had she been abandoned like this all her life? Her kind was unlike anything he had ever seen, and yet, in this moment, he didn't care about any of that. She was in his arms now, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The snow continued to fall around them, thickening the air, but the man's focus remained on one thing: survival. For both of them, the unexpected touch of warmth. Wind howled through the night, its icy breath cutting through the storm like a blade. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, his arms trembling under the weight of the small alien child. Her fragile form was still wrapped tightly in his coat, but the cold seeped through every layer. His boots sank deep into the snow with each step, his legs feeling heavier as the relentless blizzard seemed to press in from all sides. The cabin was still a distant promise, a goal that seemed to grow more unreachable with every step. The man could feel the child's coldness against his chest, her body stiff as a frozen twig, her breathing shallow and uneven. She hadn't moved since he found her, and he had no idea if she would ever regain consciousness. He had never seen anyone or anything so utterly lifeless. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, each beat more frantic than the last. He had to keep going. He couldn't stop. He didn't know what this child was or where she came from, but something inside him refused to let her die in this frozen wasteland. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm of uncertainty, and yet one truth remained clear. He had made a promise to himself, to her, that he would not leave her behind. With every step he spoke to her, even though he didn't know if she could hear him. His words were soft, soothing, meant to comfort both of them. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "You're going to be all right. Just hang on a little longer." It was then, in that moment of desperate hope, that something miraculous happened. The air around them seemed to shift, as though the storm had momentarily paused, holding its breath. A faint warmth began to spread from the child's body, a warmth that began to seep into the man's chest. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker of heat that brushed against his skin like the faintest ember. His breath caught in his throat. As he stopped walking, his eyes widening in disbelief, he looked down at the child in his arms, his heart racing. Was this some sort of trick? Had his exhaustion finally started to play tricks on his mind? No, the warmth was real. He could feel it, could sense the change, the sudden shift that began deep within the child's small body. The child's eyes fluttered open then, though they were still clouded by confusion. Her gaze was unfocused, her pupils dilated as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Her thin lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came out. The warmth continued to spread, growing stronger now, radiating from her body like a gentle wave of heat. It wasn't the warmth of a fire, but it was enough a sign, a spark of life, of hope. The man's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively tightened his grip around her. "You're awake," he whispered in awe, his voice trembling. "You're alive." The alien child's breath caught, and for the briefest moment, her eyes locked onto his. There was something in her gaze, something he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear or confusion, but rather a sense of recognition, as though she knew exactly what he was feeling. His heart pounded faster as their silent connection deepened. She was alive. She wasn't gone. There was hope. The warmth inside her continued to grow, a slow but steady heat that seemed to fill the space between them. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was something more profound, something that couldn't be explained by logic or science. The man's chest tightened as he realized that this child, this strange, forgotten being, had more power within her than he could ever have imagined. Her survival was a miracle, and he was part of it. "Don't try to speak," he said softly, brushing her hair back from her face with gentle fingers. "Just rest, we're almost there." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if they were truly close. The storm had not lessened, and the landscape still seemed endless, an ocean of snow and ice stretching out before them. But the warmth from the child was a beacon in the darkness, something that kept him moving forward, step by step. As they continued their journey through the storm, the child's body began to stir more with each passing moment. Her arms twitched, her fingers curled into small tentative fists. The man marveled at her strength, at the sudden shift in her energy. It was as though she was awakening, slowly but surely, from a deep, frozen slumber. She was no longer the lifeless, fragile creature he had found in the snow. She was something else now. Something more. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. What was she? How was she able to generate this warmth? Was it a natural part of her species? And most importantly, why had she been abandoned in the first place? These were mysteries he couldn't solve, not yet. But for now he was content to hold her, to keep her safe and warm as best he could. The storm raged on around them, but inside the small space between them, there was a sense of calm. They were both still alive, and that was all that mattered. He had no answers, no clear path forward, but he knew one thing with certainty: he would protect her. She had given him a gift, one he hadn't expected, but one he now cherished with all his heart. And so, as the blizzard continued to howl and the night seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the man held the alien child close, feeling the warmth of her body slowly growing stronger, a silent promise that neither of them were alone anymore. Fear and trust. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the man's arms, the alien child felt warmer with every passing minute. Her body had stopped trembling, her breath steadier now, though still fragile. Her eyes, still wide with confusion, darted around as she tried to take in her surroundings. The world around her was blurry, an endless swirl of white snow and dark shadows, but the warmth she felt from the man was undeniable. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, the rhythm of life pulsing through him, and it was the only thing she could focus on in this strange, cold place. The man was walking steadily, his breath heavy in the cold air. He was talking to her, but she didn't fully understand his words. Her mind was clouded, still fogged by the icy grip of unconsciousness. She felt as though she were waking from a long, deep sleep, but the feeling of uncertainty lingered. The world around her was strange, unfamiliar. She had no memory of how she had ended up here. Had she fallen? Was she abandoned? Why was she alone? As these thoughts flooded her mind, the fear started to settle in. The cold, empty feeling that had taken over her body began to creep back. She had been left in the snow to die, her body discarded. Like a forgotten object. She didn't know why, but she understood it all too well. She had no one. Her kind had abandoned her, or perhaps they had never even known she existed. And now this human, this strange creature who had never known her, was carrying her through the storm. The child's eyes narrowed slightly, her alien gaze studying the man with quiet suspicion. His face was weathered, his features hardened by time and hardship, yet there was something else in his eyes, something that made her hesitate. His warmth. His presence was comforting, yes, but it was also unfamiliar. Could she trust him? She didn't know anything about humans. She had heard the stories of violence, greed, and cruelty. She had heard of how humans could be both saviors and destroyers. Could he be the exception? Or was he just another predator, someone who saw her as nothing more than an object to use, an alien thing to be experimented on or thrown aside when no longer useful? As the fear began to tighten its grip around her chest, she felt a wave of uncertainty crash over her. What if this was just another cruel twist of fate? What if she had been wrong to hope that someone, anyone, would come to her rescue? The man might have saved her from the cold, but he could just as easily be the one to destroy her. She had no way of knowing. In that moment, she stiffened in his arms, her small form tense. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hands, still numb from the cold, instinctively curled into fists. Her body, once too weak to move, was now on edge, ready to defend itself at any cost. The warmth that had started to fill her body began to fade, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear that made her want to pull away. The man, sensing the change in her, stopped walking. He paused in the middle of the snowstorm, his eyes flickering down to the child in his arms. He had felt the shift in her body, the sudden tension, and he understood. She was scared. And why wouldn't she be? She was alone in a strange world. In the arms of a human, someone she couldn't trust. He slowly, carefully, adjusted his grip on her, trying to calm her without overwhelming her with his presence. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he spoke to her again. "It's okay," he said gently, his words meant to reassure, even though he wasn't entirely sure she would understand. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." He paused, watching her for any sign that his words were reaching her. Her alien eyes locked onto his, searching, probing, as though she were trying to read him, to figure out if he was telling the truth. The child's fear was palpable, her distrust clear. The man's heart tightened in his chest, but he remained still, careful not to make any sudden moves that might frighten her further. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled around them, the snow swirling in thick gusts, but the world seemed to fade away as they stared at each other. The child's gaze softened just slightly, and the man could see the fear in her eyes, real, raw fear, but also something else, uncertainty. He gave her a small tentative smile, a gesture meant to offer her comfort, though he knew it might not be enough. "You're safe," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "I'll get you through this, I promise. I'm not leaving you." For the first time, the child's tense body began to relax, just a little. Her hands, still curled tightly in fists, slowly opened, her fingers brushing against his coat. She could feel the warmth still radiating from his body, the steady beat of his heart. It was enough. She wasn't sure why, but it was enough to make her stay in his arms, at least for now. As they continued their journey through the storm, the child no longer tensed at every movement. She was still cautious, still uncertain, but there was something in the man's presence that began to soothe her. His warmth, his calmness, were like a beacon in the storm. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it fully, but for the first time since she had been abandoned, she felt a small glimmer of trust. The human had no reason to lie to her, and the fear that had threatened to consume her slowly began to ebb away, replaced by the faintest spark of hope that the journey was still long, and the storm was relentless. But for the first time since she had fallen into the snow, the child wasn't alone. She had someone by her side, someone who, for reasons she couldn't understand, seemed to care for her. And that, in itself, was a start. A shared journey. The snowstorm had become fiercer, its icy breath whipping across the land, but the man and the child trudged on, their steps synchronized as if they had been traveling together for a lifetime. The man, despite his exhaustion, refused to stop. His muscles ached, his breath was ragged, but there was no turning back now. The alien child, still wrapped in his coat, lay in his arms, her warmth a silent reassurance that she was still alive, still with him. It was the only thing that kept him going, the only thing that made him believe they could make it through this. The storm had turned the world into a blur of white and gray, a swirling landscape of cold and silence. It was as though time itself had stopped, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for them to reach the end of this journey. But the man didn't know how long he had been walking, how far they had come. It felt like hours had passed, but it could have been days. Every step was a struggle, the weight of the child in his arms adding to his burden. Yet he never slowed down. The child had grown quiet, her breath steady but faint, and the warmth that had been radiating from her body had begun to lessen. The man noticed it, and a fresh wave of panic gripped his chest. He had no idea what was happening to her. Was she getting weaker? Had he done something wrong? But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the journey ahead. There was no time for fear. Not now. He had to keep moving. Despite the danger and uncertainty, something had shifted between them. The silence that had once hung heavy between them now felt less like a barrier and more like a quiet understanding. The child was no longer completely stiff in his arms. Her small, alien hands had loosened, her fingers brushing against his coat every now and then, a subtle acknowledgement of his presence. It was a small thing, but to him, it was a sign. She was no longer completely afraid of him. There was a tentative trust beginning to bloom, though neither of them fully understood it. As they continued their journey, the man began to notice small details, the way the child's breathing would quicken when the wind howled, as if she could sense the danger in the storm. The way her eyes, though still large and unblinking, would follow the path before them, searching for signs of something familiar. She wasn't fully aware of where they were going, but she seemed to know the journey was important. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder about her origins. What had brought her here? How had she ended up alone in the snow, far from any civilization? But there were no answers. The child, though now more aware, was still silent, and the man had no way of communicating with her beyond his own words. He spoke to her occasionally, trying to comfort her, to offer her small reassurances. "We're getting close," he'd say, even though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Just a little longer." And sometimes he would whisper more personal thoughts, as though she could understand. "I never thought I'd be out here in this storm, carrying an alien child," he muttered with a half-hearted laugh, though it was more of a nervous chuckle. "I'm not even sure what I'm doing, but I'm doing it, for you." He had never been particularly religious or superstitious, but in that moment, a strange feeling washed over him. It wasn't hope or fear, but something in between, a sense of fate, perhaps. It was as if he had been chosen for this task, this responsibility, even though he hadn't asked for it. The child had been left for dead in the snow, and now here he was, carrying her through the storm, determined to save her. The wind picked up, biting at his face, and he pulled his collar tighter around his neck, but his thoughts were interrupted when he felt a shift in the child's weight. Her hand, which had been resting gently against his chest, suddenly twitched, her fingers curling around his coat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause, to stop in his tracks for a moment and look down at her. Her eyes were open now, though still clouded with confusion, and they locked onto his for a brief moment before darting away. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to say something, but no words came out. The man's heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. Was she trying to speak? Was this the first sign of her coming back to life? "Hey," he whispered softly, not wanting to scare her. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" The child's gaze flickered back to his face, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to understand his words. She seemed to focus on him for a moment, and then, as if making a decision, she nodded barely, but enough for the man to notice. The tiniest of movements, but to him, it felt like a victory. "I'm here," he said, his voice trembling. "I won't let you go. You're not alone." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The wind howled, the snow continued to fall. But in that brief silence between them, something unspoken passed between the man and the child, a mutual understanding, a promise. He would protect her, and in return, she would trust him with renewed determination. The man continued to walk, his steps becoming more sure, more purposeful. The snowstorm still raged around them, but now it felt like a distant noise, something that couldn't break their bond. They were together in this, bound by the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but they would face it as one. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, the man allowed himself to believe that they might just make it together. A gift beyond words, the storm had slowed to a bitter drizzle, its fury spent, leaving behind a thick blanket of snow that crunched beneath their feet. The man could see the faint outline of a cabin now, a dark silhouette against the otherwise white landscape. His heart surged with relief, but the moment was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the soft weight of the alien child in his arms. She was still warm. The heat she emanated a steady comfort against the harshness of the world around them. But something had changed. It had been hours, maybe even days, since he had first found her in the snow. And in that time, he had begun to notice the small shifts in her. Her movements, though still fragile, had become more deliberate. Her eyes, though not fully focused, seemed to track his movements more now, as if she were beginning to piece together the world around her. And for the first time since he had picked her up, she seemed aware. Her breaths were steady, but shallow, and her body had stopped trembling. The warmth that radiated from her wasn't just the result of the heat he provided. There was something more to it. He couldn't quite explain it, but he sensed that she was recovering in ways he hadn't anticipated. The cold, empty shell of the child he had found in the snow was slowly becoming someone or something else. But even as he noticed these changes, the man couldn't help but feel an odd sense of apprehension. He had saved her, yes, but there were still so many questions he had no answers to. Where had she come from? Why was she abandoned in the snow? What kind of being was she? And most importantly, why did he feel so drawn to her, as though their destinies were inexplicably tied together? As they neared the cabin, the alien child shifted slightly in his arms. Her small hands, still covered in frost, reached up and gently touched his chest. The man looked down at her, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected any form of communication from her, not yet, anyway. But as her fingers brushed against his shirt, a soft, almost melodic hum escaped her lips, the sound low and almost imperceptible. It wasn't a language he understood, but the tone was unmistakable, a voice, a sound of recognition. For a moment, the man froze, unsure of what to do. The sound had caught him off guard, but there was something deeply comforting about it. He had never heard a sound like that before, yet it resonated deep within him, stirring something he couldn't quite place. The hum was gentle, soothing, and it made him feel seen, as if the child, in her own way, was reaching out to him, offering something in return for the warmth he had given her. "Are you trying to speak?" He asked quietly, more to himself than to her, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't respond with words. Instead, her eyes flickered up to his, and for a brief, surreal moment, it was as if she was looking straight into his soul, understanding something that words couldn't explain. She lowered her head again, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her, but the humming continued. It was like a song, soft and ancient, carrying with it a message of hope and connection. The man could feel it, deep in his chest. Her gift, whatever it was, had touched him. It wasn't just the warmth that had saved her. It was something more, an emotional bond, an unspoken promise. Her survival had awakened something in him, something that no amount of physical warmth could provide. He glanced at the cabin, now only a few yards away. The promise of warmth and safety was so close, but for the first time, he didn't feel an overwhelming urge to rush toward it. He hesitated for a moment, holding the child gently in his arms. He had spent so much time focused on survival, on getting them both to shelter, that he hadn't stopped to consider the emotional weight of what was happening between them. She had been abandoned, left in the cold to die. Yet somehow she had found him. And he, despite all the doubts and uncertainties he had felt, had found her too. They were connected now, bound by a shared experience that neither of them could fully comprehend. And perhaps that was her gift, the ability to make him see that, despite the harshness of the world, there was something beautiful in their bond, something worth protecting. The moment lingered, stretching out like the silence before a storm. Then, with a small sigh, the alien child's hand dropped from his chest, her eyelids fluttering as sleep began to pull at her again. He couldn't help but smile softly, though it was tinged with sadness. She was still so fragile, so uncertain. But she was alive, and for now, that was enough. The man carefully adjusted his grip, holding her closer to his chest as they reached the cabin. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the warmth inside a welcome embrace. He stepped inside, the scent of firewood and dried herbs filling the air. The room was small, humble, but it was all they needed. He gently laid the child on the bed in the corner, making sure she was comfortable, her body cocooned in the warmth of blankets. He sat beside her for a moment, watching her sleep, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. Her skin, though still pale, no longer looked as though it was frozen in time. The color was returning to her cheeks, and the warmth that radiated from her was now more than just physical. There was something about her that felt alive, vibrant, like a new life emerging from the ashes of something lost. And for the first time since he had found her in the snow, the man allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know what this strange bond between them meant. But in that moment, with the alien child resting peacefully before him, he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of their journey together. A future unwritten. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the corner of the small cabin, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The storm outside had weakened, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, silent calm. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, as if the earth itself were taking a deep breath, recovering from the chaos it had just endured. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, earthy and comforting, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The man sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the alien child lying in the bed before him. Her small form was wrapped in the warm blankets he had gathered for her, and though she still looked fragile, there was a sense of peace about her now that hadn't been there before. Her chest rose and fell steadily with each breath, and the faint hum of her strange melodic voice had stopped, replaced by a deep, untroubled sleep. Her body, once so cold and lifeless, was now warm and alive, the glow of the fire highlighting the slight flush of color returning to her cheeks. He couldn't help but watch her, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and uncertainty. What had brought her to this point? Why had she been abandoned in the snow? Her kind was nothing like him, nothing like anyone on Earth. And yet, in the short time that they had spent together, the bond between them had become undeniable. He had carried her through the storm, protected her, and in return, she had given him something he had never expected, something he hadn't even known he needed. She had given him a sense of purpose. The weight of responsibility still sat heavily on his shoulders, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. He knew now that he couldn't walk away from this. No matter where she came from, no matter how different she was, he couldn't leave her. She had changed something inside him, something that he hadn't realized was missing until she had shown up in his arms, frozen and alone in the snow. The man stood up and moved quietly over to the window, peering out into the dim, snowy wilderness beyond. The world was vast, seemingly endless, and filled with more questions than answers. He had been a loner all his life, never attached to anything or anyone for long. His journey through life had been solitary, filled with moments of escape, with little to anchor him to anything greater than his own survival. But now, everything had changed. The child was here, and in a strange, unexplainable way, she needed him, and he needed her too. For the first time in his life, he felt tethered to something beyond himself. He didn't know how long she would be with him, didn't know what would happen in the days or years to come. But in this moment, he knew that their paths had collided for a reason, and he couldn't turn away from that. The child stirred in the bed, her eyes fluttering open slowly. She looked disoriented at first, her gaze unfocused, but when her eyes finally met his, there was no fear in them, only quiet curiosity. The man smiled softly, the weight of the world momentarily lifted by the gentleness of her expression. "I didn't think you'd wake up so soon," he murmured, his voice hoarse from the hours of worry and fatigue. The child blinked a few times, her alien features still a mystery to him, but there was something familiar in the way she looked at him. Slowly she raised her hand, her small fingers reaching toward him, tentative but purposeful. He took her hand in his, gently, as though handling something fragile. Her skin was warm now, not the icy cold it had been when he first found her. The warmth she gave off was subtle, but it was there, a sign that she was growing stronger. Her fingers curled slightly around his, and for the first time since they had met, she spoke quietly, almost like a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, but clear enough for him to understand. The man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to speak, not yet. He had been so focused on her survival that he hadn't even considered the possibility that she would start communicating in any form. But there she was, speaking to him in a language that was strange, yet familiar in its meaning. "You're welcome," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "I didn't know if I could save you. I wasn't sure I could do it, but I'm glad you're here." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She seemed to be processing his words, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Safe," she whispered again, a word that seemed to carry more weight than it should. It was as if she understood the concept of safety not just as a physical space, but as something deeper, a state of being, an emotional connection. The man nodded. "Yes, safe, for now. But what happens next? What do we do now?" Her gaze shifted, and for the first time, she looked past him, out the window toward the endless white of the world beyond. Her expression softened, and she hummed that strange, melodic sound again. It was a tune of sorts, a song of quiet resilience. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything. There was a world out there, a world that she had come from. A place that was so far away, it seemed impossible. But that world had left her here, alone, abandoned in the snow. And now here, in this small cabin, with this human who had somehow managed to save her, she had found something else. Hope. "I don't know what comes next," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but we'll figure it out. Together." The child looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with something he couldn't name, trust, perhaps even gratitude. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe that he was anything more than just another human in a world full of them. Yet in the quiet moments of shared warmth and silence, she had found something in him, a quiet promise, an unspoken agreement that he would not leave her, that he would do whatever it took to protect her, and he had no intention of breaking that promise. He sat back down beside her, his hand still holding hers, and in that moment, something shifted within him. They were no longer strangers. They were no longer two separate beings crossing paths by accident. They were connected now, bound by something far deeper than survival. A future was beginning to unfold, one they could not see yet, but one they would face together. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and obstacles neither of them could predict. But for the first time in a long while, the man felt ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. Because in the end, they were no longer just surviving. They were living, and for the first time, that was enough. The path ahead, the days following the storm, were calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that had nearly consumed them. Inside the small cabin, the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of life began to settle in. The alien child, who had once been nothing more than a fragile, lifeless form in the snow, had transformed before the man's eyes. She was no longer the strange, silent being he had rescued. She was becoming something more, something he could almost understand. She was awake now, her small body healing at a pace that both awed and mystified him. Each day, she grew stronger, her movements more fluid, her gaze more focused. The hum that had once been her only form of communication now gave way to occasional words that didn't always make sense, but were nonetheless familiar. Her language was not of this world, but the intention behind it was clear. She was learning, adapting, just as he had in the face of his own struggles. The man had come to call her Airy, a name that seemed to suit her, though he wasn't sure where it had come from. It was simply the name that felt right to him. She hadn't objected, and there was a small, almost imperceptible smile that tugged at her lips whenever he said it. It was a smile that hinted at something deep within her, something buried beneath her alien exterior, a recognition, perhaps, that this name, this place, and this man had become a part of her new reality. But even as Airy grew stronger, the man knew they couldn't stay in this cabin forever. The world beyond the small, sheltered space they had created was still dangerous, still unknown. Though the snow had ceased falling, the earth was a silent, alien place. The future they faced was uncertain, full of questions neither of them could answer. And the man knew, deep down, that Airy had been sent here for a reason. This encounter was not a random one. He had been changed by her arrival, just as she had been changed by his intervention. But what came next? What did the future hold for two beings so different, yet so connected? How could they navigate a world that had, for all intents and purposes, forgotten them both? As the man sat by the fire, his thoughts a whirlwind of uncertainty, Airy approached him. Her steps were quiet, measured, the soft sound of her bare feet on the wooden floor breaking the silence between them. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood there, her alien eyes watching him with an intensity that made him feel both seen and unsettled. He looked up at her, his heart tightening slightly. There was a look in her eyes, a question, a desire for something more than this life they had carved out. It was the same look she had given him the first time she had awoken, that same silent plea for understanding. "Marie," the man said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. He had gotten used to calling her name, even though it still felt unfamiliar. On his tongue, "What do you want? What do you need?" Her gaze softened, and she took a step closer, her small hand reaching out toward him. She didn't answer him with words, but the motion was enough. She wanted to be near him. She wanted reassurance that whatever came next, they would face it together. He reached out and took her hand gently in his, the warmth of her skin still a marvel to him. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, the words almost a fail. Confession. But I do know this, we've made it this far. And I'll make sure you're safe. For a long moment, they stood together in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling around them. Ares' small form pressed closer to him, and for the first time since the night they had met, the man allowed himself to breathe fully. There was peace in this moment, peace that they hadn't yet earned, but had found nonetheless. But that peace didn't last long. The door to the cabin creaked open, a sharp gust of wind sending a chill through the room. The man's hand instinctively tightened around Ares, and he turned his attention to the doorway. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light outside. The figure was tall, their form cloaked in a heavy coat that obscured most of their features. The man's breath caught in his throat, and for a brief moment, his heart stuttered with panic. Who was this person? What were they doing here? The stranger stepped into the cabin slowly, carefully, their eyes scanning the room. The man instinctively stepped between the intruder and Ares, protectively. His body tensed, and he could feel the unfamiliar heat of fear beginning to rise. This wasn't what he had expected, not after the storm had passed and the calm had settled in. "I'm sorry to intrude," the figure said, their voice deep and measured. It was a man's voice, but it wasn't one the man recognized. The stranger's eyes were dark, almost unnervingly so, and they scanned Ares with a curious intensity. "I've been searching for her." The man's mind raced, his chest tightening. Searching for her, for Ares? But how could he have known about her? And why had he come here? "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice sharp, the protective instinct rising up in him. He stepped forward, standing firm between the stranger and Ares. The stranger smiled, though it was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know what she is," he said quietly. "And I know what you're protecting. You've done well to keep her alive, but she won't be safe here for much longer." The man's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What do you want with her?" The stranger's eyes glinted, and there was a coldness to his voice that made the man's stomach drop. "You don't understand yet, do you? There's more at stake than survival. She was never meant to be alone." Ares, sensing the tension, took a hesitant step forward, her alien eyes flicking between the man and the stranger. The warmth that had been surrounding her seemed to waver, replaced by a subtle nervous energy. The man's grip on her tightened. "I don't care who you are or what you think you know. I'll protect her, no matter what." The stranger nodded, his smile deepening with an unsettling calm. "We'll see about that." As the man stared at the stranger, a sense of foreboding settled over him. This was just the beginning. The world was vast, and they had only just begun to scratch the surface of whatever forces were at play. And as much as he had tried to convince himself otherwise, he knew now that Ares' arrival on Earth was no accident. Her journey was far from over, and theirs was only beginning.